All right, it looks like we've still got some folks joining us, but hello to those of you who are here. I'm going to kick us off for the evening. My name is Ariel Cates. I'm the Director of Programming at Village Preservation, and I'm so glad that you all are here with us. Just a little bit about Village Preservation. We have been documenting, celebrating, and fighting for the preservation of Greenwich Village, the East Village, and NoHo since 1980. We work to expand and extend landmark and zoning protections and stop inappropriate development, while also encouraging appropriate development in our neighborhoods. We host roughly 75 programs a year, all of which are now virtual, and most of which are free and open to the public. Our events are meant to illuminate the cultural and architectural heritage, history and depth, and the value of preservation in our communities. We are a nonprofit, membership-based organization, so your involvement and support mean the world to us. You can learn more at our wonderful new website, villagepreservation.org, and please consider becoming a member or making a donation if you're able at villagepreservation.org/donate. So we are very grateful to our co-hosts for this evening, the Center for the Living City and the Historic Districts Council. The Center for the Living City works to advance social, environmental, and economic justice in cities. They believe that, in the words of Jane Jacobs, cities have the capability of providing something for everybody, only because and only when they are created by everybody. The Historic Districts Council works to ensure the preservation of significant historic neighborhoods, buildings, and public spaces in New York City. And I'll put the links to both of those organizations in our chat to us if you'd like to learn more. So just a little bit of Zoom protocol. Though I won't be visible during the event, please feel free to use the chat to say hi, tell me where you're joining from, or to raise any issues or thoughts. If you have questions specifically for our speakers, please use the Q&A function, which you can do at any point during the talk, and we will answer as many of those as possible towards the end. So I am very glad to introduce our MC for this evening, Village Preservation Executive Director Andrew Berman. Andrew Berman has been the Executive Director at Village Preservation since 2002. He previously worked in state and city government, where he focused on issues including land use and historic preservation. In 2013, he was named to the Vanity Fair Hall of Fame for his preservation work and was named one of the 100 most powerful people in real estate by the New York Observer. A lifelong New Yorker, Andrew has an art history degree from Wesleyan University. So thank you again, everyone, for being here. And Andrew, take us away.
Thank you so much, and thank you to all our attendees and of course our co-sponsors who Ariel just mentioned. I also want to thank Ariel and Harry Bubbins, who I think you can't see, but who did a tremendous amount of work to put this together. I'm really excited to hear from our speakers and their perspective, and I'm just so thrilled to be able to virtually unveil this plaque today. You know, we could spend a couple of hours talking about why Jane Jacobs deserves a plaque, but I'm going to have to sort of boil it down into a couple of minutes. But, you know, first I just want to say that this is actually the 16th of our historic plaques. It's a little bit amazing to me that it took us 16 to get to Jane Jacobs, but I'm glad we did. But our plaque program is intended to help celebrate, highlight, and spread knowledge about the many, many important people, events, and institutions connected to Greenwich Village, the East Village, and NoHo. Some of the other plaques mark the homes of Jean-Michel Basquiat, James Baldwin, Elizabeth Blackwell, Frank O'Hara, Lorraine Hansberry, the Fillmore East, the Martha Graham Dance Studio, and many more. So find out more about that on our website. So first, a little bit about the site where we're virtually unveiling the plaque today. 555 Hudson Street was built in 1842, and it's where Jane Jacobs lived from 1947 to 1968. It's located within the Greenwich Village Historic District, which was designated in 1969, just a year after Jane moved from New York to Toronto, Canada. And to say that Jane Jacobs had a profound impact upon the world in her time on Hudson Street would be a vast understatement. In fact, calling it a vast understatement is a vast understatement. There are so many things that she did there that continue to resonate to this day. And certainly for an organization like Village Preservation to really inform the way we approach our neighborhood, preservation, activism, and quite simply just what makes cities work. A couple of the sort of highlights, and these are just a few of them, is that of course during her time here, Jane helped lead the successful campaign to get cars out of Washington Square, to defeat Robert Moses's planned Lower Manhattan Expressway, which would have destroyed many neighborhoods of Lower Manhattan, Soho, Little Italy, the South Village, Lower East Side, parts of today's Chinatown. And also to stop plans for urban renewal in the West Village, where about a dozen or so blocks of today's West Village would have been demolished, razed to the ground, and replaced with urban renewal towers. And therefore, so many of these charming and historic blocks that we know and love would have disappeared forever. And she played a key role in making sure that that didn't happen. And of course, one of the main vehicles by which she did all of this was with the publication of her great work, The Death and Life of Great American Cities. And there's so many incredibly important lessons to be learned from that book and from what Jane did. And I just want to share a couple of my own perspectives on them. Certainly, she made us all realize that sense of place is incredibly important, and that there are human touchstones that we have in our built environment that we really connect to, that form our identity and are among the reasons why we choose to live, raise a family, open a business, walk the streets, shop, seek entertainment in whatever location we choose, because we feel this sense of connection to it. She also taught us that old buildings are not necessarily out of date and to be tossed aside, but in fact they have great value. They are resilient, they can be reused, and they in fact have a special value because they have this connection to our history and our culture. I think one of the most important things, though, that Jane taught us was that the power of observation is incredibly, incredibly important. She really, really pushed back against what was an overwhelming tide of thinking in the mid-20th century about how cities functioned and how they would succeed. And instead of simply buying into what she and everybody else was being told, she observed what she saw around her, which she most famously referred to as the sidewalk ballet outside her front door on Hudson Street. And she saw how people interacted with one another. She saw how they interacted with and related to the street, the buildings, the people. And she, from those observations, came up with these incredibly profound realizations about what makes communities succeed. And those are realizations that we are still carry with us and still inform our thinking today, although the struggle against those who would try to take us in a different direction seems eternal, and certainly as present today as it was 60 years ago when she was fighting these battles. I also think one of her great lessons was that she taught us that the experts don't always have all of the answers. Just because somebody is in a position of power, it doesn't mean that they're right, and that local communities need to be listened to. They need to have a place at the table. They need to have a voice in the decision-making process about their future, and that that's an important part of the way that communities succeed. When everything is simply imposed upon them by fiat from on high, that's a recipe for destroying what makes communities work. And these are incredible lessons that we can be incredibly grateful that Jane was able to so eloquently demonstrate and share with the world. And certainly it's part of Village Preservation's mission to hopefully continue to try to carry that on today. Jane was, we were graced and honored to have Jane as a member of the Board of Advisors of Village Preservation. And she sat down with us to do an oral history, which allowed us to capture in her own words the stories of what it is that she did and saw in the 1960s and 1950s when she was in the neighborhood. Go to our website, and in our resources section, you'll find our oral history connection, and you can hear her voice and hear her expressing in her own words exactly what it is that she did and lived through. And it's a great honor to us to have that. And then, of course, in 2006, when she passed, we were really honored to work with the Center for the Living City to have a wonderful celebration of her life and legacy here in Greenwich Village, appropriately in Washington Square Park under the arch. That really, in my almost 20 years now as Executive Director of Village Preservation, was really one of the high points of the work that I've done here. So we're gonna hear from a few other people this evening, and of course, normally we would be doing this out front, but because of COVID and by a wonderful coincidence, because of some terrible weather, we're doing it virtually, which I think will work a lot better. One of our participants, though, who I believe is up next, is going to share with us a pre-recorded video message, and that is from Academy Award winner Marisa Tomei. So we're going to hear from Marisa first, who will also explain what her own special connection to Jane Jacobs is. So Ariel, take it away.
Hello, everybody. Hi, I'm Marisa Tomei. Thank you for having me here at this very special occasion. I'm honored to be here. I'm just going to read my remarks today. I want to thank the Village Preservation and the co-sponsors and guest speakers at today's event. Some of you may wonder why I'm part of this celebration of the life and work of Jane Jacobs. Well, the answer is naturally, I am a New Yorker, and I'm Brooklyn raised. All New Yorkers should care about the life and legacy of Jane Jacobs. But of course, some of you may know that in Matt Tynauer's documentary, Citizen Jane, Battle for the City, I was the voice of Jane Jacobs. I was honored to be a part of that great film and read her words whenever they were shared in that movie. The words of Jane Jacobs and her work continue to resonate today, even as they take on new forms and new shapes and include more voices and communities in the efforts to have a thriving, equitable city. We're still fighting to have a city with small, independently owned shops where we know the owner, and one with historic neighborhoods recognized for the value they bring in aesthetic experience and economic activity, and one where diversity is recognized and appreciated. Jacobs once said of the high-rises Robert Moses favored and of the expressways he tried to drive through Lower Manhattan, even through Washington Square Park, "This is not the rebuilding of cities. This is the sacking of cities." There is no more Robert Moses, but we all still have to stay involved in standing up for our communities. And while we honor Jane Jacobs today and the best of what she inspired, the work to make sure that local voices are heard in the decision-making process in cities transcends any one person, even if it makes a good story to frame it as one individual versus another, as the Jane Jacobs versus Robert Moses narrative is often told. Organizations like Village Preservation and the co-sponsors presenting this plaque and program today carry on that spirit of civic engagement. It's an example for all of us in every neighborhood in New York City to make sure your voices are heard and that we have a say in what our neighborhoods will look like today and in the future. Even if we do not always agree, that is the spirit of what Jane Jacobs inspired, getting involved to make your neighborhood, your city, your country, and even your world a better place. I'm so glad that there will be a historic plaque at 555 Hudson Street in Greenwich Village, where Jane Jacobs lived for such a pivotal time of her life. I really do look forward to reading it and seeing it in person. Thank you for having me today, and I really look forward to hearing the rest of the speakers.
So that was really wonderful. And we're incredibly grateful to Marisa for taking the time to record that message for us. As we're grateful to all of our speakers today for taking the time to be with us this evening. So our first live speaker is the owner of the building, Susan Spehar. And we want to thank her for her involvement and her support for embracing this historic plaque project. As you probably can guess, before we're able to place a plaque on any building, we of course need the owner's permission. Susan has been incredibly enthusiastic about celebrating the history of her home and this initiative. And I wish I could say that was always the case with every property owner we reached out to about trying to put a plaque there to mark a great historic figure. So I really want to extend my thanks and gratitude to Susan and ask her to say a few words.
Well, thank you, Andrew. I am really happy to be part of this plaque ceremony. I love living in this house. I love living here in New York. I think a lot about Jane Jacobs, and especially about her eyes on the street philosophy. Literally every morning when I get up, I open my shutters and look out on Hudson Street to see what's happening. I can tell the weather. I know what to wear. Whoops, I don't know if something just happened to my screen. Sorry, I hope that was okay.
You're all good.
I can tell, you know, what clothes to wear by what people are wearing outside. I can see who's having coffee at Panino Mucho Gusto. I see people walking by, sometimes famous people. I see delivery trucks and where they're delivering and what they're delivering. I see laughter. I see people arguing over parking spaces, which sometimes is quite a show. I hear dogs barking. But it makes me feel like so much a part of life here. It makes me feel like a real New Yorker. And I remind myself of Jane Jacobs and her courage and determination. And I hope some of it rubs off. I know it has influenced my life, and I kind of feel her in here. I have kind of a funny story. In my first year here, I think it was on May 4th, I opened my door to go grocery shopping, and there must have been 40 people standing right there in front of me. And, you know, I hadn't been here very long, and I was totally taken aback and confused until I heard someone kind of whisper in the back, "Is that Jane Jacobs?" And obviously, no, I'm not Jane Jacobs, but I am thrilled to be living here. For now, yeah, it's my house, but the history of this house will always belong to New York City. And I'm just grateful that I get to live in it. So put on a mask and come on over. Thanks.
Thank you, Susan. And I don't think you could have said it better. That really sort of embodies the spirit of, I think, both the neighborhood and our gratitude for the history that we get to bask in the glow of all around us and that we benefit from. So our next speaker is somebody I've known for a very long time and I'm very fond of, Roberta Gratz. Roberta is an award-winning journalist and author of several books about urban development, including The Battle for Gotham, New York in the Shadow of Jane Jacobs. She co-founded the Center for the Living City with Jane Jacobs herself, and she's really dedicated her life to these kinds of principles and efforts around what makes cities work and how we can preserve them and move them forward. So welcome, Roberta, and I'm looking forward to hearing what you have to say.
Roberta, you're on mute. That should work.
Roberta, you had unmuted yourself for a second, but then remuted.
Is that worked?
Yep.
Okay. First, thank you, Andrew. It's a pleasure to be here. And I have to say, Susan, I think Jane would be thrilled to hear what you had to say and to know someone was living in her house who had so many of the same instincts. And it also sounds like when you look out your window, you see what Jane saw. So there we go for urban continuity. And it's an honor to also follow Marisa. Her voice in the movie was just wonderful and made me feel that Jane was really with us. So I'm pleased to do this for all sorts of reasons, but let me just address why I think a plaque on 555 is so important. 555 is much more important than just the home of Jane and her family. 555 is where she learned to observe and understand a city, where she began to recognize the complexity of urbanism, how the life of a street reflects the life of the neighborhood, how the interplay between work, home, local services, and public life all interconnect. In the opening of her classic book, Death and Life of Great American Cities, she writes, "The scenes that illustrate this book are all about us. For illustrations, please look closely at real cities. And while you are looking, you might as well also listen, linger, and think about what you see." Observe, observe, observe. That's what she taught us. Our most important lesson. And that is what she did on Hudson Street. And it is important to honor this site as this plaque does for that reason. So much of what she learned by her observations is second nature to us now, at least to those who understand and remain committed to authentic urbanism. The importance of the street, the need for proximity to mass transit, the connectedness that neighbors feel when they see each other on the street, and the bonds created with local businesses. It was all one well-orchestrated ballet, every day a variation of the basic rhythm, every day a different set of star performers in unplanned orchestrations. When Jane was writing Death and Life, the suburbs were in full swing. Highways were carrying increasingly high numbers of cars. Mass transit was being undermined, if not totally wiped out, by the likes of Robert Moses. Density was a dirty word. Cities were considered an anachronism. Rundown, but still vibrant and often integrated neighborhoods were being plowed under. But Jane looked out her window or stood on her stoop at 555 and saw a different picture. She broke it down into pieces: streets, parks, housing, transit, old buildings, neighborhoods, mixed uses, and more. She helped us understand how urban life was one big fabric with all the threads carefully woven, all balanced and interdependent in the healthiest of ways. And she also helped us understand that if you pull one thread or puncture even a small hole, the whole fabric is weakened and at risk. But the understanding she developed from her view at 555 was purposely misinterpreted by those to whom she was a threat. They chose, and still do, to depict her as advocating low-rise city neighborhoods, when in fact density and scale are very different concepts. In fact, the Greenwich Village of 555 is very dense, considerably denser than New York City neighborhoods like Stuyvesant Town, with moderately tall apartment houses widely spaced and surrounded by endless green lawns. But Jane was not referring to height. She was, however, referring to the density necessary for a healthy, functioning urban neighborhood. Here in New York, this lesson has not been learned, or it's actually ignored. New super tall buildings are promoted as offering density when they do no such thing. The need to keep repeating Jane's lessons has not diminished. It is useful to send people to 555 to stand and observe, observe, observe. The lessons endure. Then they should go back to their own neighborhood and observe, observe, observe. Amazing what you can learn from what you see. 555 is also where Jane became an activist. Outraged that Robert Moses and other city officials could declare her street and the larger village neighborhood as a slum in order to justify total clearance and rebuilding by favored private developers, Jane organized. And with her neighbors and thousands of West Villagers, they mobilized, marched, held big signs, gathered thousands upon thousands of petition signatures without the internet, testified at public hearings, wrote letters, and more. They made it politically impossible for city leaders to move forward with the plan to bulldoze the West Village. Jane and the committee went even further. They worked with an architect to design and develop West Village houses to fit in and add population to the neighborhood without losing one resident. And they called it without displacing one sparrow. As much as HDA head Roger Starr stripped the amenities and delayed construction to drive up costs, nothing could stop the project. Nobody will want to walk up, the experts said. From day one, West Village houses had a waiting list. The lessons of West Village houses is lost on the so-called experts because the community did it better than any developer could. Jane's lessons are endless. It is good to have a 555 plaque to help people remember, observe, and learn any and all of Jane's timeless lessons. And although someone mentioned Robert Moses is no longer with us, I would disagree. He's here in many different shapes and forms and costumes, and we know who they are, and they are always our target, as Jane would want us to make them. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Roberta. Not surprisingly, you did her great justice, and it is amazing to hear the stories about back then and how similar they are to the dynamics that we face today. But that's an ongoing conversation. So let me introduce my the next speaker. Her name is Mindy Thompson Fullilove. She's a social psychiatrist and a professor of urban policy and health at the New School. She has a special interest in the links between the environment and mental health. Welcome, Mindy.
Yeah, hi. Thanks so much. It's great to be here. Great to see you, Roberta. That was lovely.
Thank you.
It's very exciting to see this plaque. I'm, as Andrew mentioned, a social psychiatrist, which means that I look at the connections between society and mental health, the mental health of populations. People say, so why are you talking about Jane Jacobs or anything about cities if you're a psychiatrist? And so, and it really goes back to studying the AIDS epidemic and learning that part of the spread of AIDS in the United States had to do with the abuse of the city. Among other things, the New York City program of planned shrinkage, and how planned shrinkage, by destroying huge neighborhoods and dispersing people, had spread the AIDS virus all over New York City, and in that way helped to spread it all over the world. But as a psychiatrist, although I understood the concepts, the epidemiological concepts, what I wanted to know was what happened at the level of the people. How did they feel? How did this work? And so I started studying what people call the psychology of place. And when I started studying that, I didn't know like what to read. And one of the first books people said was, well, you should read Death and Life of Great American Cities. And so Jane Jacobs was really my first introduction to what is a city and how does it work. And what a great place to start if you are somebody like me, really concerned with How does the city make us feel? How does the city work? And so, but this is a great leap from sort of Hudson Street and things that are, kind of functional. So she's dissecting all the things that aren't working. But she's not going into things like planned shrinkage and the brutal devastation of the neighborhoods of South Bronx, of Harlem, of the East Village by city policy. So how do you then say, okay, here are neighborhoods that were standing, that were functional, that were good neighborhoods that have been flattened? What has that done? And so Roberta's point that Jane Jacobs says, well, look, just look, and you'll be able to see, is very important. That was been very much the lesson that I have taken from Jane Jacobs. But the other thing is that she gives guidance of what to look at. So the whole concept of this sidewalk ballet is very important. So she says, the stretch of Hudson Street where I live is each day the scene of an intricate sidewalk ballet. I make my own entrance into it a little after 8 when I put the garbage can. Surely a prosaic occupation, but I enjoy my part, my little clang, as the droves of junior high school students walk by the center of the stage dropping candy wrappers. She's just watching people walk by. The genius of it is that she tells us this is a ballet. And that helps to transform it for us, that she uses this word of honor. Ballet happens at Lincoln Center. So she said, no, the ballet happens on the sidewalk in front of my house. So I was like, oh, okay, I get it. I'm supposed to go look at the ballet, or I'm supposed to ask somebody who looked at the ballet. So in 2001, my research team was asked to be part of a project looking at fatal school shootings. And this was being carried out by the National Research Council, Institute of Medicine, and we published this book, Deadly Lessons, Understanding Lethal School Violence. And my team took on a study of 2 sets of shootings at Roosevelt High School in East New York. And it was actually a retrospective study. The shooting had happened 10 years earlier. So how do you find that out? So one of the things that became very important was to understand that this was a neighborhood that had had very harsh suffering from all of these terrible urban policies. Sort of the clones of Robert Moses that Roberta was saying, they're out there and they're doing terrible things to the city, and they had done terrible things to East New York. And so the kids growing up there were growing up in a broken neighborhood that was broken off from the city, and that was left to rot and flood it with guns and drugs. So the street ballet was no longer about a little garbage can going out. It was about guns and drugs. And how do you walk down a street? How do you hold yourself if that's what's going on? And I was very fortunate that a brilliant journalist, Greg Donaldson, had been there at the time writing a book and had recorded the street ballet of East New York in his book. And I was just very lucky that Jane Jacobs had taught me to understand the description of the street ballet when I read it. And I think in that way, we were able to begin to understand, to get inside the situation that had driven 2 young men to kill others, to kill their peers inside the school. And to really be able to hear what they were trying to explain to us. We were fortunate that we were able to interview both of the young men that had done the shootings. And, just as they tried to say, it was just a terrible, terrible, terrible what had been done. So Jane Jacobs is trying to teach us how to make the city a wholesome place. But Robert Moses and all the Robert Moseses don't care about the poor, they don't care about people of color, and they want to destroy the city as a wholesome place. And so they create great sickness, but they can't contain the great sickness. And we are watching now what happens. If you create the conditions for the spread of disease, it will spread, and it will spread wherever it wants to. So we have to understand what Jane is really fundamentally trying to teach us, which is that if you want to have a healthy nation, you have to have healthy cities. If you want to have healthy cities, you have to do what she said. So, and this includes learning how to see, learning how to see the threads of the social world in things that look so different from 555 Hudson Street that you would be shocked to say, that's a street ballet and that's a street ballet. Thank you.
Great.
Thank you so much, Mindy. I really appreciate your words. And I want to thank everybody for taking the time to be with us here today, even virtually. We're now moving to the crescendo of the evening, which is the uncovering and revealing of the plaque, which of course normally we would do in person, but we have a video recording of it. And we thought it'd be fun to not only show the plaque being revealed, but a little bit about how it was installed. So now I'm going to turn it over to Ariel to roll the video. Wow, that was really, really wonderful. It was especially nice to see Ricky and Bobby installing the plaque, which took place earlier this month, which is easier, it's a little harder than it looks like it might be. And so now, as kind of a culmination, I'm going to read the text of the plaque. Ariel, if you can just bring that up, great. So here it is, and it's now there on the building at 555 Hudson. So whenever you get a chance, go, as Susan said, put on your mask and take a look. Jane Jacobs, May 4th, 1916 to April 25th, 2006. The author and urbanist bought this 1842 row house in 1947 and remained here until 1968. While here, Jacobs helped lead successful campaigns to ban cars from Washington Square, to defeat Robert Moses's planned Lower Manhattan Expressway, and to stop his plans for urban renewal demolition in the West Village. She wrote The Death and Life of Great American Cities while living here. And now everybody who passes by will be able to see that and remember the incredible things that Jane Jacobs both did and gave to the world while she was living in this lovely little house on Hudson Street. So I'm now gonna turn it back over to Ariel, who's gonna facilitate the question and answer conversation.
Can I add one thing?
Sure.
Jane once told me that when they bought the house, it was very interesting because young families like theirs could not get a mortgage. And it was the beginning of really the undermining of the city, people leaving the city, not just because they wanted to, but they couldn't buy a home. And they were in effect redlined whether they were white, black, or pink. And it was interesting that she and others who, the few that were able to do it, either had their own means or were able to borrow from family, but that it was not possible, while you could get all the help in the world to buy a house in the suburbs, you couldn't get any help to buy in the city.
Very true. So Ariel, I think you have maybe some questions from the public.
I do, and hopefully we'll get a few more. Please feel free to send them in, everyone. Michael, hi Michael, wants to know when did Jane leave the village?
About 68, and it was a combination of reasons. It is somewhat in dispute. She had two sons that refused to fight in the Vietnam War. And her husband said one day, if I stay here, my wife and daughter will go get arrested standing in front of bulldozers, which they were doing, and my sons will go to jail for not serving in the war. And he went up to Toronto for a job and wound up getting a job with the best architect in Toronto, and came home and said, we're going. And they moved to a single family home, and it was and it was while the fight against the expressway was still going on, but it was basically over. And within months, they discovered that there was an expressway about to bulldoze the home they had moved to in Toronto. And she was right back in another fight, which she helped win in Toronto.
Yeah, amazing. The Spadina Expressway, is that the?
Yeah.
Yeah, incredible.
We have a question about Jane's. It's sort of a general philosophical question about Jane's urban visions and how they played out.
What does that mean?
Great question.
I'll tell you something that Jane said. We once had a little bit of an argument. Many times we did, but she said, you know, my book didn't change anything, she said. To which I said, are you kidding me? It's all over the world. It's changed minds. She said, there are two kinds of people. Foot people understood and appreciated and absorbed her book. Car people did not. And when you look at it today, it is essentially that kind of division. There is no doubt. I mean, everybody recognizes that her ideas in one form or another, absorbed by so many people who knew how to mobilize or didn't know how to mobilize until they saw her example. But look at your own organization. West Village Preservation has been amazing in what you've been able to, you know, advocate and stop. So her ideas are there. And she was thrilled on her last visit to New York, which I believe was a year or two before she died, with her last book. She thought things looked so good. And she was really pleased, even with changes. It was still the village that she recognized. So sure, her ideas have been absorbed. Can you measure in what way? No, but you can look at one fight after the other and recognize where her ideas are.
Yeah, and I just want to add to that. I think one of the amazing testaments to her success, and I think anybody who sort of really manages to kind of change the culture, is now even the people who are seeking to do exactly the opposite of what she would want, appropriate her language and try to make it sound as though they're doing more or less what she would have us do. You know, right now we're just in the middle of, or we're just at the beginning of this stage over this fight about the city wanting to rezone, upzone Soho and NoHo. And it's completely clothed in the language of Jane Jacobs. We want a vital, diverse, mixed-use district. We want new development to be contextual, when all of it is nothing of the sort. But they recognize that they have to at least pretend that that's what they're doing, because she won the war of ideas. And now the other side is really seeking to kind of appropriate that and use it to kind of go back to doing exactly what Moses used to want to do. And that just shows how incredibly successful she was in shaping the way that we think about these things.
Thanks to all of you. Jean just wants to know if Jane's children are still living, if they're around.
There are three of them. Her daughter lives way up in the northwest of Canada, some small town, married. I think she's almost, I think she's something of a craftsperson. At least that's the last I knew. I don't keep up with them, but she has, and then she has a son who lives in Seattle, I think it is. And he carries on her tradition. He sits in front of bulldozers and does all sorts of things. And then Jimmy, who lives in Toronto, brilliant scientist, technician, went in a totally different direction, and is actually retired. But his brilliance was unbelievable, and very well versed in Jane's ideas, and she always acknowledged that. And there are times, every now and then, if there's anything that I'm doubtful about in terms of one of Jane's thoughts, I'll call Jimmy and say, you know, did Jane this, that? And he's a great resource.
And Ned, the son who you mentioned, who sits in front of bulldozers, came down for our celebration in 2006, and I had the pleasure of meeting him then. He was a lovely guy.
He's usually accessible.
I was reading through our oral history with Jane Jacobs in advance of this, and she talked about using her children in the fight for Washington Square Park and how successful that was because everyone just would sign a petition that was being held by a child. I really liked that.
She used the kids. One of my favorite events that they staged was they cut the ribbon at Washington Square under the arch for the last car to pass through Washington Square. And she had two kids, one of which I think was her daughter, cut the ribbon as a celebratory event. There's a great photograph of it.
Yes, we have it in our historic image archive. So go to our website and check it out.
Yeah. Oh, we're getting lots of questions now. This is so great. Yes, James, unfortunately you did miss the video, but I will send it to you. Michael wants to know, did Jane Jacobs and Robert Moses ever actually meet?
Apparently not. I can't remember. I sometimes confuse it with the question that's often posed to Bob Carroll. Did he and Moses ever meet? I think the closest that Jane ever came to meeting Moses was stomping at, one of his public hearings.
For what it's worth, my impression of Moses is that he would never have deigned to give an audience to someone like Jane Jacobs.
No.
Leslie,
hi Leslie, wants to know, did Jane play a part in the landmarking of the historic districts?
Absolutely. She was a fierce advocate for landmark designation. It didn't happen until the year after she left the neighborhood. She left in 1968 and the Greenwich Village Historic District was designated in 69. But she not only helped to bring that to realization, but she had actually pushed very hard to have the landmark designation extend all the way to the Greenwich Village waterfront, which the 1969 designation did not do. It was incredibly extensive and it was much larger than some in the city wanted it to be, but it left quite a bit out. And a big part of Village Preservation's mission over the years has been to try to extend the landmark protections to the waterfront. And in recent years, we have been able to do that to a large degree. And in fact, we have this wonderful letter that Jane wrote to the early chair of the Landmarks Preservation Commission, where she identified, I believe it's 11 buildings in the West Village that she thought it was critical be landmarked, all of which, and she didn't even know this at the time, were going to be left out of the Greenwich Village Historic District. And in the intervening years, we've gotten 10 of the 11 landmarks, along with dozens of buildings around them. So she continues to help make landmarking happen in Greenwich Village even to this day.
Well, also I might add that it's kind of a funny story. When I was invited to go on the Landmarks Commission in, I guess right after Bloomberg was elected, I talked to her about it. She said, "What do you want to do that for?" And we had a long discussion, and I said, "Jane, you know, I got to give it a try. Let's see what I can do from the inside." And she said, "Well, if you're going to go on the commission, you must get the West Village extension on the Historic District extension." Well, you guys were already working on it, and it was in process. And I was able to assure her, because I knew it was going to pass, that it would happen. Sadly, that extension actually did happen shortly after she died. But I console myself in knowing that she knew it was going to happen, and she was pleased about it. And the letter that she wrote to the commission is a very interesting one, because preservationists should read it very carefully. It's not just about the buildings as we think of them in terms of their style and their design and all of that. She was trying to make the point that the West Village waterfront is where the economy of the country started. And the waterfront was very important economically, historically. And those buildings represented that history. So it's an important letter in her understanding her concept of historic preservation. And it's not necessarily the concept that, you know, all preservationists embrace.
I agree. And that letter is on our website, just another plug for our website. And I'll sort of second that. It wasn't about, you know, this building has, you know, this kind of style of lintels or this sort of intact cornice. It was about a sort of a history, a story, a kind of historic ecosystem that these buildings were a part of, that she thought it was really important to preserve. And if I'm not mistaken, I think she passed away maybe 2 or 3 days before the extension designated. It was
Exactly.
it just barely barely missed it.
But I mean, it was so close that she knew it was happening. It just, and she wouldn't at that point probably have even absorbed the fact if she were still alive. She was pretty sick at the end.
Thanks. Okay, I have a question for Mindy, which I'm just gonna read. I'm gonna read it. Would like to ask Mindy if in the course of her work that she has come across other writers, residents, theorists, activists that touched upon or built upon the work of Jane Jacobs in the varied other communities you mentioned that have different socioeconomic characteristics and yet share similar issues, or where else in NYC or in the country have some of these principles you mentioned been used to engage communities in a holistic way?
That's a very complicated question. So I'm just going to arbitrarily take a piece, which is to, I really want to support Roberta's point, which is that, you know, Jane Jacobs articulated something that people know about their neighborhoods. They live in a functional neighborhood and they know it. You know, in the beginning of Death and Life of Great American Cities, she talks about unslumming. And the idea of unslumming is that, you know, people are living in a neighborhood and it's kind of, you know, been disinvested, but they invest their time and their energy and their labor. That's what Soho is about, right? Soho is unslummed. And it becomes wonderful. So she was talking about, you know, the west end of, no, the north side of Boston, right? In Death and Life of Great American Cities.
Yeah.
But this happens everywhere. And those people knew what to do, how to make a great neighborhood. So she's articulating from the point of view of people, city life. So she reflects back to us what we feel in our bodies, what we have in our relationships. This is healthy. So I think you see it everywhere. There's a neighborhood in Ann Arbor that was able to defeat urban renewal and is now like the most charming little section of Ann Arbor, and it's where Zingerman's famous deli is located. But it's because of that, because people understood the preciousness of the neighborhood. So I think it's everywhere. And when people who haven't heard about Jane Jacobs hear about her, they're like, oh yeah, it's almost like I knew that. They knew that. And you know what is this about? This is about this conflict between these archetypal figures, Jane Jacobs, who speaks for us, and then Robert Moses, who speaks for all the forces that tear cities apart, the forces of big development, the forces of racism, the forces of capitalism gone crazy. So this is a deep conflict we're in, but when we lift up Jane Jacobs, we lift up all the people.
I'd like to add to that. Mindy's absolutely right. And I mean, there's nothing Mindy's ever written that I don't agree with, but she, as I have over many years, traveled around the country, and there are these neighborhoods that have been totally, reborn through the efforts of only local citizens. It's the only way neighborhoods are reborn, period, end of story. Some of those people never heard of Jane Jacobs, and her point was always that you didn't need Jane Jacobs to tell you what you see, that if you trust your own eyes and your own understanding, you don't need her. And she would constantly say that because she really didn't want people to think she was what she really was the voice of wisdom for all of us. But she insisted that people understood. And this is true in neighborhood after neighborhood where no one ever heard her name, and yet the same evolution of the neighborhood unfolded. I also have to say, one of the things that's so wonderful about Mindy's work is that she gets into neighborhoods and low-income communities that Jane didn't focus on in the same way. Not that she didn't care, because if you remember, and I've had arguments with people about this, very early on in Death and Life, she talks about Harlem and going to Harlem and being educated by the urban renewal that was going on in Harlem and the destruction of that neighborhood. But the public conversation was not in the way it became with the sensitivity to the racial and economic structure of neighborhoods. This came later. And I know even in my own writing, in my first book, I wrote about gentrification as the answer, that it was happening in places everywhere from neighborhoods in Cincinnati to San Antonio to Savannah, all over the country. But gentrification at that point was when the neighborhoods were almost half or more abandoned. There was room for people to move in and become part of the diverse mixture in the neighborhood. That started to change. And this thing with Soho is so classic. And I don't know what the answer is here. But in every neighborhood that is successfully regenerated, and I have written at great length in one of my books on the regeneration of Soho, there comes a point when the predators come in and cash in. They're never there when you need them in the early days, and they never want to do the right thing. They just want to do cash in. And then they co-opt the language. They're basically full of shit. and I'm sorry, pardon my language, but it really aggravates me. And now this Soho thing is the worst. There is no way that what they're proposing to do in Soho will not, first of all, it will harm the neighborhood in every way you guys have articulated. But it is the epitome of what we've seen in every successful reborn district around the city. And all the rezoning around the city that has now gone in and in many injurious ways hit low-income neighborhoods as well as high, and not so much the high. They protect the low density in the high-income neighborhoods. But at any rate, it's, as Andrew said, they do not only co-opt the language, they just, I think I've said it, makes my skin crawl. Sorry.
Hear, hear.
we're getting many chats of affirmation, and you definitely answered some of the other questions with what you just said, which I appreciate. We've got, I think this will be our last question. Gail wants to know, beyond the fights that Village Preservation is doing to keep super talls out of our neighborhoods, are there other places that we should be watching out for?
Everywhere.
Yeah, it's certainly happening everywhere. And, you know, it's funny, I get calls from and emails and messages from groups across the city. And I wish we had the resources to get involved in, you know, every battle in every corner of the 5 boroughs, which we can't, but we certainly can kind of give advice and direction and counsel. But you know, these battles are not unique to our neighborhood or our city or even our country. You know, I'm amazed when I travel around the world to see how similar a lot of these dynamics are in a lot of places. And I think in a lot of ways, you know, sort of Roberta kind of summarized it, which is that, you know, truly successful neighborhoods and cities come from kind of a grassroots place. And then as soon as they're successful, you know, the money guys want to exploit it, and they want to make it their own, and they want to take it from you, and they want to do what they would do with it. And you see that dynamic everywhere. So you really don't have to look far. Although certainly we've got enough going on in our neighborhoods to keep you very busy, and certainly to keep us very busy if that's what you're looking for. So Ariel,
yes.
Should we let these good people?
Yes, thank you. Thank you so much, everyone, for being here and for taking part in this. And I know that Jane would be very pleased with this conversation. So I'm grateful to all of you for being here, and to you, our speakers this evening.
Ariel, can I interrupt for a minute?
Yeah, of course.
We're all suffering through the same current agony. For those of you who have never read Jane's last book, oh God, what's the title? This is terrible. Mindy, do you remember?
Isn't it Dark Time Ahead?
Yes. Dark Age Ahead. Jane predicted everything that's happening now. It's scary. She predicted the rise of authoritarianism. She warned against the loss of memory. She predicted the mortgage crisis of a couple of years ago, with homes being the currency. She ranted against education as a credential and not a real thing. It's not a big book, but it's so profound. I suggest everyone, Dark Age Ahead. Her point was it didn't have to come to a dark age, but she was trying to warn us. The warning's all there, and I suggest that if you haven't read it, I recommend it highly.
Thanks. Yeah, and we're I'm gonna send out a bunch of links in our follow-up email, so that will probably include a bit of a reading list. So keep an eye out for that, everyone. Thank you so
and if
much.
you missed any part of this evening or want to see it again, of course, we'll also be sending out a video of the entire evening. So
Yeah,
this will live
so
on too.
please share it, and thank you again so much.
And I want to give a shout out to the Center for the Living City. Check out our website. We have a program actually called Observe, in which we work with communities who organize young women to observe their neighborhoods and turn into activists. And we do all sorts of other things. So Jane helped us start the organization. So I recommend to everyone to check out our website.
And I just put that link in the chat. So
Great.
yeah.
Thank you so much to all of our speakers and to everybody who turned out tonight. And I'm very much looking forward to going to see the plaque myself once it's a little bit drier out there.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Good night,
Take good
everybody.
care, everyone. Have a good evening.
Great.